Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. Before actually getting started, I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing, offer testimony, and ask questions. And without objection, so ordered. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. Today we'll be examining the Federal Aviation Administration's oversight of commercial space transportation. We're at an exciting time in the aviation world. In the past few years, this committee has met regularly to discuss the advent of drones into national airspace system, and we're here this morning to talk about the burgeoning industry of commercial space transportation. Before we begin, I'd like to note that yesterday the FAA released its long overdue final rule on small drones. And although we are continuing to review it in detail, I'm very pleased that the rule focuses on safely integrating drones into the operation today while providing flexibility to permit more advanced type of operations as technology improves. It's a very good step forward, I think. It has been 7 years since this subcommittee last held a hearing dedicated to this topic. Since that time, the space shuttle has been retired, leaving the United States without a domestic option to transport humans into space and requiring NASA to pay millions of dollars per seat on Russian spacecraft. Private industry, with the support of the FAA and NASA, is working to fill this transportation gap while developing new and innovative methods to transport passengers and cargo safely and efficiently into space. The result has been the domination of these commercial space industries by the United States in virtually all areas. United Launch Alliance, a joint venture of Lockheed Martin and Boeing, provides valuable and highly reliable launch services to the U.S. government. Orbital ATK has operated 5 successful unmanned supply missions to the International Space Station, and we wish them well on their launch 2 weeks from today. SpaceX and Blue Origin are leading pioneers in the effort to bring down the cost of commercial space launches by reusing launch vehicles. Virgin Galactic, Worldview Enterprises, and Xcor seek to offer new and exciting experiences and bring space travel and tourism to the general public. These companies and many others contribute to a highly innovative industry, advancing U.S. leadership in the field. I believe we are witnessing a major change in transportation, one that will match the energy and enthusiasm of the early days of barnstorming. These advances require the close cooperation and oversight of FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, or AST. AST's mission is to protect the public, property, and national security and foreign policy interests of the United States during commercial launch or re-entry activities to encourage, facilitate, and promote U.S. commercial space transportation. Commercial space transportation is still an inherently risk-filled endeavor. Our hearing summary outlines 2 specific accidents, but there have been others. We want to ensure that AST and industry learn from these incidents in order to lay the foundation for future commercial space transportation safety regulatory framework. In November 2015, Congress passed the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, which has helped position the industry in the United States to further expand and capitalize on our nation's leadership in this field. We have invited you all here today to get a better sense of the state of the industry following enactment of this law and to learn about opportunities and challenges related to commercial space transportation. Though this is a newer topic to me and many on the subcommittee, much of the FAA's work in this area is performed in my district at the FAA's premier flagship technical facility in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. There, private companies are working with the FAA on a number of projects, including modeling of debris fields, simulating launches and re-entries, utilizing the expertise of air traffic controllers, and testing communication system between spacecraft and air traffic control. We appreciate all of the work that industry and FAA are doing at the FAA Tech Center in order to continue advancing safe commercial space transportation. As this subcommittee continues to assess the current state of commercial space and transportation industry, it is important that industry engage with members of this panel. I would also encourage all members to reach out to our distinguished witnesses and others in the commercial space transportation field to learn more about how this transportation sector impacts each and every congressional district. I'm sure this will be an interesting hearing, and I very much look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel of witnesses. Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Larson for any statements he may make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for calling this hearing to take a closer look at the FAA's oversight of commercial space transportation. This committee has not convened a hearing on commercial space transportation since 2009, and I think we can all agree that there have been many exciting advancements in the industry that have occurred over the last 7 years, so I think it's really ripe for us to take a look. And as we've seen recently, there's a great deal of promise with the expansion of the commercial space industry. Take, for instance, Blue Origin's success this weekend in landing the New Shepard rocket for the 4th time. This reusable capsule could be used in the future for human spaceflight. Or SpaceX, which has been able to land its Falcon 9 rocket on an unmanned ship after successful missions to deliver communication satellites into orbit. But the promise of commercial space does not end there. Several other companies, including many in my home state, are venturing into uncharted territory when it comes to mining asteroids, developing reusable vehicles, repairing satellites in orbit, and other research that we once thought was impossible. In fact, this week in Seattle, there's a conference on space where many of the leading companies in the industry are showcasing the latest in commercial space, including commercial space transportation. But with that immense promise comes the need to make sure that we have a robust safety framework in place, and it's not an easy thing to achieve, particularly as Congress is cautious not to overregulate this nascent industry. The commercial space industry reminds me a lot of what we're currently confronting with unmanned aircraft systems. Both industries are users of the national airspace, experiencing fast-paced growth, and both in their relative infancy. As technology rapidly evolves, the regulatory side is continually playing catch-up. The small UAS rule the FAA announced yesterday is representative of this challenge. The FAA had to balance the interests of the public and other uses of the national airspace while at the same time being careful not to stifle the industry. So as the commercial space industry continues to evolve, we are going to face similar challenges. So I'm very curious to hear what our witnesses' perspectives are on how the government and industry can work together to build consensus around a regulatory framework that fosters innovation while achieving the highest possible level of safety. I'm also interested to hear some perspectives on how we can safely and efficiently integrate commercial space launches into our air traffic control system. Since 1989, the FAA has licensed or permitted over 280 commercial space launches. Those numbers are forecasted certainly to significantly increase in the coming years. What that means is the FAA's air traffic controllers will need to coordinate existing operations with those of the commercial space industry and of course, throw into that UAS. It will not be an easy undertaking. So to me, it seems the most prudent way to accomplish, that is by having all of our air traffic control operations reside with the FAA, the agency which is also responsible for licensing of these commercial space launches. And while it does not fall under the jurisdiction of this committee, it would be remiss if I did not mention my interest in commercial space exploration and its impacts on national security. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, I urge all of us to pay close attention to how the DoD leverages the private sector for national security missions, including launches. And as commercial capabilities in satellite imaging and communications continue to improve, the DoD's use of those services will also grow. Thus, I consider it vital that the DoD be given a seat at the table when the FAA exercises oversight of commercial space transportation, given the national security interests at stake as well. So it's a very exciting time for commercial space and commercial space transportation, and I look forward to learning more this morning. And with that, I want to again thank the Chairman for holding this hearing and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. I'd now like to recognize Mr. DeFazio. Peter, if you have any remarks you'd like to make.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. You know, I'm hoping the panel will. I haven't had a chance to read testimony, but we'll discuss. You know what our role should be after 2023 when the moratorium on FAA regulating safety expires. If we're looking at a robust civilian, basically tourist or science-based, commercially launched vehicles into space. And then secondly, I have a concern, and some will remember this, for many, many, many years, it was a mandate that the FAA both promote and regulate the aviation industry. For years, I tried to change that, and in fact, during one reauthorization, my amendment had been defeated, and people said there's no conflict and there was no problem. Unfortunately, the ValueJet crash happened. We were in conference, and I got a call saying, how would we put your provisions in the bill? I didn't get everything I wanted, but I got most of it. There's an inherent conflict between promotion and regulation and oversight of safety, and I think that we need to look very carefully at that, and I hope that some of the witnesses can address that. I mean, it would be more appropriate to say Commerce will promote, FAA will regulate, in my opinion, but I'd be interested in the opinion of those who are going to testify. So thank you really for holding this hearing today, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a very important topic.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. Now we'll turn to our distinguished panel of witnesses today. We have Dr. George Nield, Associate Administrator of Commercial Space Transportation of Federal Aviation Administration, Dr. Gerald Dillingham, Director of Civil Aviation Issues for the United States Government Accountability Office, Mr. Michael Gold, Chairman of Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, Mr. Michael López-Alegría, Vice Chairman of Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, and Tabor MacCallum, Chief Technology Officer of Worldview Enterprises. I thank you all for being here today. I'd also like to ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. And to the witnesses, since your written testimony is in the record, if you can try to come close to the 5 minutes, that would be helpful. But Dr. Nield, you're recognized.
Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson.
Can you, I think your mic needs to be flipped on.
Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee.
I'm sorry, could you pull it a little closer?
Okay. Thank you. Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning about the FAA's oversight of commercial space transportation. In my testimony today, I will briefly describe the FAA's responsibilities, discuss recent developments in commercial space transportation, and identify some of our key challenges. The FAA has exercised oversight of commercial space transportation since 1995, when the Office of Commercial Space Transportation was established as one of the FAA's lines of business. Our mission is to ensure public safety, property, national security, and foreign policy interests of the United States during commercial launch and reentry activities, and to encourage, facilitate, and promote U.S. commercial space transportation. This dual mission is an important part of our culture. Although the FAA has licensed or permitted 290 launches to date, there have never been any fatalities, serious injuries, or significant property damage to the general public. This is an exciting time for commercial space. Following the retirement of the Space Shuttle, SpaceX and Orbital ATK have been delivering food, clothes, and scientific equipment to our astronauts on board the International Space Station as part of the Commercial Cargo Program. Separately, Boeing and SpaceX have been awarded contracts under the Commercial Crew Program to take American astronauts to the ISS, beginning as early as 2017. Although these are NASA contracts, the FAA is a critical partner in both programs. We are also starting to see some very impressive advances in technology. Blue Origin has demonstrated that it can launch and land the same rocket numerous times on suborbital flights. And SpaceX has shown that it can deliver satellites to orbit and then successfully recover the first stages of its rockets, touching down either on land or on a drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean. These are incredible achievements that demonstrate both the engineering prowess and the capability for innovation that are hallmarks of American industry. One of the key challenges that we are facing today involves new and non-traditional space operations. Currently, the FAA licenses commercial launches and reentries, but does not regulate activities in orbit or beyond. For example, if a company wanted to launch a payload to the moon, the FAA would license the launch, but not what happens on the lunar surface. However, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty requires the government to authorize and continuously supervise all non-governmental activities in space. Last fall, Congress directed the Office of Science and Technology Policy to develop a process to address this issue. After extensive discussions both within the interagency community and with industry, a plan was developed and has now been forwarded to Congress. Under the recommended legislative proposal, the FAA would be able to grant mission authorizations consistent with the international obligations, foreign policy, and national security interests of the United States. A second challenge concerns how best to deal with the growing problem of orbital debris. To operate safely in space, operators must know where their systems are and when they have a possibility of colliding with other objects. Currently, the Department of Defense collects space surveillance data and sends out collision warnings when needed. Congress directed the Secretary of Transportation, in concurrence with the Department of Defense, to provide a report on the feasibility of a civil agency taking on this responsibility. We hope to provide this report to Congress soon. Finally, as the commercial space transportation industry continues to grow, we must ensure that we maintain our ability to keep pace. The FAA appreciates that the appropriations committees have so far provided the full FY17 appropriations request for our office. This funding is critical to the work that we are doing, and we are grateful for your continuing guidance and support. In closing, I would like to recognize my predecessor, the late Patty Grace Smith, who passed away just a few weeks ago. A true visionary, Patty once observed, "Space is an attitude. It's a set of capabilities, an acceptance of risk-taking activities to uncover potential breakthroughs and endless possibilities. That is precisely why we love it." Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared remarks. I would be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dillingham, you're recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member DeFazio, Mr. Duncan, and other members of the subcommittee. My testimony this morning focuses on two areas. First, the developments in the industry, and second, the related challenges FAA faces in overseeing and promoting the industry. Regarding the developments in the industry, as Dr. Nield has testified, one of the important developments in the industry in recent years is that FAA has been licensing and permitting increasing numbers and types of launches. The expansion includes moving from exclusively single-use launch vehicles to suborbital reusable vehicles. This expansion includes changes in the launch industry that are bringing significant changes to FAA's oversight, including determining whether and when to regulate the safety of crew and spaceflight participants, and issues related to the increased workload for licensing and permitting launches. Regarding the regulation of safety, in 2014, FAA released a set of recommended practices on human spaceflight occupant safety. Currently, FAA is working with the industry to develop voluntary consensus standards that are needed to implement the agency's recommended practices. Regarding the second challenge, which focuses on increasing workload for FAA, the challenge includes licensing new and more complex types of vehicles and technologies, such as where companies are developing hybrid launch systems, which have both aircraft and rocket-powered components. This challenge also includes licensing more complex launch sites. Launch sites traditionally have been located in coastal areas at federal launch facilities. FAA is licensing more non-federal launch sites, and in 2014, FAA licensed an inland launch site that is co-located at a commercial airport in Midland, Texas. The potential impact of the challenges could have far-reaching implications. For example, the expansion could affect the federal government's overall liability exposure and indemnification for launches. In general, by increasing the volume of launches and reentries, and with the introduction of new types of launch vehicles, the probability of an accident occurring also increases. A catastrophic accident could result in third-party losses over the maximum probable loss, or MPL, which is now capped at $500 million per launch and could in turn invoke federal indemnification. In our July 2012 report, we found that FAA's MPL methodology, which was established in the 1980s, should be reviewed and updated. Given the advances that have taken place in catastrophic modeling, we recommended that FAA undertake such a review. Congress subsequently mandated the FAA to review its MPL methodology and report back to it by April 2016. To date, FAA has not submitted the required report. Another concern related to the expanding commercial launch industry is FAA's budget requests and resource needs. In 2015, we found that FAA generally based its budget submission on the number of launches that it was projecting for the following year. But during 6 of the 10 years from fiscal year 2005 to 2014, the actual number of licensed and permitted launches was much lower than projected. For 2016, FAA projected over 30 launches and reentries. To date, there have been 13 launches in fiscal year 2016. We recommended that FAA provide more detailed information in its budget submission about the various launch-related activities and overall workload. In our review of FAA's 2017 budget submission, we found that FAA had provided more detailed information. We plan to continue to work with FAA to assess what other steps they are taking to measure their commercial space launch workload and to provide that critical information to Congress to assist it in its oversight. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee, that concludes my prepared statement.
Thank you, Dr. Dillingham. We'll now turn to Mr. Gold. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, distinguished members of the subcommittee, and excellent subcommittee staff for this opportunity to discuss critical issues facing the FAA AST and the commercial space industry. My name is Mike Gold, and I am the chairman of the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, or COMSTAC, a federal advisory committee comprised of executives from a wide variety of aerospace corporations. Before I delve into the challenges and opportunities that the commercial space transportation industry faces, I would like to take a moment, like Dr. Nield, to acknowledge the passing of his predecessor, Patty Grace Smith. Ms. Smith initially appointed me to the COMSTAC and served as the Associate Administrator of Commercial Space Transportation for an unprecedented 11 years. Ms. Smith was a beloved and well-respected leader in the commercial space world who fostered an environment of growth, innovation, and cooperation between industry and government that we're still enjoying today. It's actually appropriate that I begin my testimony with a reference to Ms. Smith because I first met her at a meeting during which we were attempting to address the issue of private sector operations in low Earth orbit, or LEO. At that meeting, I was told the AST has authority for commercial space transportation launches to orbit, as well as reentries from orbit, but that no government agency has authority over private sector operations in or beyond LEO. 16 years later, we have still failed to answer this basic question, and I come before you today begging for a resolution. This problem stems from Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, ratified by the U.S. in 1967, which requires countries to provide authorization and continuing supervision of their private sector space activities. The U.S. signed the Outer Space Treaty, creating an obligation for the continuing supervision of non-governmental entities, but we failed to craft a mechanism for such supervision to take place. This created a potential regulatory quagmire that domestic companies are already suffering from. Fortunately, a simple, effective solution is available. Congress should, as soon as possible, direct the AST to update its regulations to support a mission licensing process. The mission licensing approach, or some iteration thereof, could mirror the AST's existing payload review procedures and would be limited to requiring only basic information, such as if the payload or planned activity will conform to the international treaty obligations or interfere with national security interests. The requirement for continuing supervision would be explicitly met by inserting a proviso into every mission license for the company to inform the AST if they experience a material change to their activity. This concept would be fully address the continuing supervision requirement via a benign registration-based regime. Even if there were no outer space treaty, establishing a simple, efficient means of registering domestic commercial space activities in and beyond LEO would make sense to prevent potential conjunctions and other forms of harmful interference between domestic and foreign outer space activities. This issue must be resolved, and it must be resolved with alacrity. In addition to chairing the ComStack, I am also a vice president of Washington operations for Space System L'Oreal, the world's most prolific commercial satellite manufacturer. As you've seen in the videos, which have been playing in the background, we are about to enter a new era of robotic satellite servicing, wherein satellites are no longer built on Earth and then disposed of, but instead are refueled, refurbished, and enhanced while still in orbit. This new world of Satellite 2.0 will create a revolution in capabilities, impacting every aspect of our daily lives in ways that we cannot now even begin to imagine. However, what I can predict with utter certainty is that the companies and countries that are leaders in satellite servicing and orbital assembly will enjoy an overwhelming competitive edge over nations that have fallen behind. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, and NASA each have their own pilot programs to demonstrate satellite servicing. But in order to transition such capabilities to the private sector and to make the U.S. a global leader, more support, programs, and funding are needed. And the government must not immediately throw up a regulatory roadblock by failing to address the Article 6's continuing supervision requirement. Moreover, I would be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity to also raise the ComStack's concern over funding shortfalls at the AST. The workload at the AST continues to increase rapidly, far exceeding the relatively meager growth in the AST's budget. Without proper funding, I fear the AST will soon simply run out of bodies to handle their ever-increasing workload, resulting in licensing and other administrative delays that could substantially hamper commercial space transportation development and encourage companies to move their operations overseas. At nearly every ComStack meeting, the committee has recommended support for increased AST funding. I cannot think of another example where industry is uniformly and consistently called for increasing funding for a regulatory agency, and this situation is both a tribute to Dr. Nield's leadership as well as a warning sign regarding the dire need for additional resources. Again, I appreciate this opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering your questions, and I urge the subcommittee to take expeditious action to ensure that in the future, commercial space companies can focus more on launches and less on lawyers.
Thank you, Mr. Gold. Mr. López-Alegría, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, and Ranking Member DeFazio, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for organizing the hearing and allowing me to offer some thoughts as the Vice Chair of the ComStack. Compared to the esteemed Chair of the ComStack.
Excuse me, could you pull your microphone a little closer?
Or is this, hello, test? Is this better?
Much better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Compared to Mr. Gold, I'm a latecomer and a rather reluctant recruit to commercial space. In the summer of 2006, I was a NASA astronaut in Baikonur, Kazakhstan, waiting to launch to the International Space Station on a Russian Soyuz rocket. Not 2 years earlier, a commercially built hybrid launch system consisting of a strange mothership airplane and a rocket-powered glider attached to its belly took off from the Mojave Air and Spaceport. After detaching from the mothership, the rocket blasted its way to an altitude of 100 kilometers, recognized as the boundary of space, and then its pilot made a glided landing on the same runway from which it had departed. 5 days later, it happened again, clinching the Ansari X Prize and signaling the dawn of the commercial space age. Back in Baikonur, I was scheduled to rideshare the Soyuz with someone bearing the same name, Anusha Ansari. I was honestly none too happy about it. Space was the realm of professionals, and I didn't spend all that time training to babysit a tourist. But in the 10 or so days that I spent in space with Anusha, my views on space tourism were forever altered. As the first person to blog from orbit, she reached tens of thousands of people who otherwise wouldn't have cared about ISS, about NASA, or about space. She sparked imagination in adults and inspired kids. She made people look up instead of looking down. She represented a wonderful idea, the democratization of access to space. I'm mindful that we're a long way from being able to hop on a rocket like we take Uber or Southwest, but we're starting. It's an oft-used but nonetheless valid analogy. Commercial human spaceflight today is where commercial aviation was in the 1920s. As of today, something like 550 people in the history of humanity have been above 100 kilometers. In the next several years, that number will double, and growth in the following decades will be exponential. Make no mistake, space is a tricky business. Massive amounts of energy are focused to propel a spacecraft in its intended direction during launch and insertion, and the same energy must later be carefully and precisely shed for deorbit and landing. But what was once the domain of only nation-states is now a small but dynamic industry where entrepreneurship, innovation, and efficiency are leveraging the advantages brought about by computer-aided technologies to make business cases close and unleash the competitive forces of free markets to start a new kind of space race. A threat to any nascent industry is overregulation that might stifle innovation and cut off potential solutions to difficult technical problems. Per the provisions of the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004 and subsequent extensions, while Dr. Nield's office effectively protects health and safety of uninvolved public and the safety of property, it is not currently allowed to issue regulations on occupant safety in commercial human spaceflight. As a pilot and an astronaut, I can assure you that a robust safety culture is an important part of any flight operation, and commercial space is no different. While Congress has wisely directed the FAA to step aside and let industry take its first baby steps, it is incumbent upon that industry to demonstrate the willingness and ability to self-regulate. The development of voluntary industry consensus standards serves just such a purpose, and these standards can later serve as the building blocks of regulation once an appropriate amount of experience is gained and data collected, and rulemaking is therefore allowed. I will admit that it has been a bit of a struggle to convince a disparate group of companies whose vehicle designs vary greatly in size, shape, and even destination to come to the table to work on something that doesn't immediately positively impact their bottom line. But I can honestly say that we are converged and heading in the right direction. An important element of NASA safety culture is effective training. For over 40 years, a key tool in preparing members of an astronaut corps with backgrounds that include not only pilots but also scientists, engineers, and doctors has been flight in high-performance military aircraft. Exposure to physiological stressors, wearing unfamiliar gear such as a helmet, oxygen mask, and other equipment, and using the concept of cockpit resource management to work as a team to make quick decisions with real consequences, all combine to make this type of training an excellent means to prepare non-aviators for space missions. As applied to commercial spaceflight, such an experience would reduce the risk of a potentially safety-compromising outcome from a first-time flyer, and might also be used as an entry-level and affordable trial to help inform a potential spaceflight participant's decision on pursuing a suborbital or orbital flight. There are several companies that are interested in providing such training, but since these military aircraft fall in the experimental category, they are prohibited from being used for compensation or hire. If stringent criteria that establish relevance to commercial spaceflight and that demonstrate superior levels of instructor-pilot proficiency and aircraft maintenance history are met, it is well within the Secretary's purview under the obligation to encourage, facilitate, and promote commercial spaceflight to support legislation or rulemaking that would allow such operations. I firmly believe this is an important addition to the commercial spaceflight industry. I thank you for this opportunity to testify and look forward to hearing questions from the subcommittee.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. MacCallum, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman López-Alegría, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member DeFazio, members of the subcommittee. FAA's oversight, regulation, and promotion of commercial space transportation has fostered a strong and growing American industry. The human spaceflight regulations that govern large segments of our industry are currently temporary and I believe should be made permanent. This impermanence and subsequent uncertainty is one of the largest factors influencing the future success of our industry. Additionally, the industry's growth will require the FAA to seamlessly incorporate routine commercial space operations into the national airspace system, without which we run the risk of a conflict between airports, airlines, and the commercial space industry. I will explain 3 actions that Congress can take to continue to foster the commercial space industry and protect the public's interest. First, some background. I am a founder and the CTO of Worldview Enterprises. Our Arizona-based company is the operator of Spaceport Tucson and is developing and operating balloon-based vehicles working at the edge of space. Like an ice cube floating on water, our vehicles float on top of the Earth's atmosphere. Our vehicles have made numerous flights to high altitudes for research, and we are the world record holders for human flight under balloon, flying to 136,000 feet. Here is Virgin Galactic Spaceship One, aircraft plus rocket system designed to take spaceflight participants to the edge of space in a suborbital rocket ride. Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket uses a vertical takeoff approach to provide participants with a spaceflight experience. The Worldview Voyager capsule will ascend to the edge of space under a large balloon, shown here. All three of these companies' human spaceflight operations are regulated by the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation, with whom we have worked for many years. I am happy to say that the FAA Associate Minister responsible for this office, Dr. Nield, runs a truly great organization. Thank you for the opportunity to convey an industry's perspective on FAA oversight of commercial spaceflight. Spaceflight operations involving humans, called spaceflight participants, are regulated under a regime based on the participants being informed of the risks and formally consenting to them. The regulations provide extensive protection of the uninvolved public, protection of property, and safe integration into the national airspace system. This informed consent regime ingeniously fosters innovation, technology development, and investment by creating a market for tourists, researchers, and astronauts to fly in space. This, like other tourism or sporting activities such as skydiving, paragliding, and scuba diving that involve informed consent, waivers, and releases. Members of the public have the right and freedom to voluntarily engage in activities where they believe the benefits outweigh the informed risks. However, unlike skydiving, the regime for human spaceflight operation is temporary, called the learning period. It is subject to extension by Congress, and under certain conditions, all or part of this informed consent regime can be ended by the FAA. The idea behind the learning period was that a time will come when the entire human commercial spaceflight industry should be transitioned to a regime in which the safety of a spaceflight participant is regulated. The informed consent regime is creating an industry and should not be subject to termination. At the same time, there is a desire and long-standing vision, as we've heard, to see the commercial space industry evolve into routine operations with the success and safety of the commercial airline industry. I believe that the best solution is for two regulatory regimes to permanently exist in parallel: the existing informed consent regulatory regime or license, and a new extended license, a regulatory regime that includes spaceflight participant safety. An extended license would be required for operations that constitute common carriage under federal aviation regulations. For example, Virgin Galactic would offer regular one-hour service from New York to Sydney under an extended license. For services whose destination is space itself, common carriage does not apply, and the current license protecting the public property and national airspace is appropriate. Voluntarily garnering an extended license for such activities would confer, I believe, a great competitive advantage to operators. It is in the government's interest to maintain our country's leadership in aerospace by creating a stable yet flexible regulatory regime. I encourage Congress to take the lead in this area with three actions. First, make the informed consent license permanent. Second, direct the FAA to develop an extended license to include participant safety. And third, make it a high priority for the FAA to seamlessly incorporate routine commercial space operations into the national airspace system. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much. Now turn to Mr. Larson for questions.
Thanks. Mr. MacCallum, thanks for ending on those notes about actions to take. Is it your opinion that FAA could take these actions with the current learning period or moratorium that Congress has in place through 2023?
I believe that the FAA could develop an extended license, one that involved the safety of human spaceflight participants in parallel right now. And one of the benefits of that is it allows the voluntary industry standards to move from a voluntary basis within the current license regime into being part of that extended license. I do believe, for the sake of industry stability and investment, that ending the impermanence of the current license regime would be beneficial, especially in the context of developing a permanent license that does involve the safety of participants.
Yeah. Dr. Nield, would you agree? What would be your answer to my question? Would the FAA be able to move forward on these kinds of recommendations without lifting the moratorium?
Our understanding of the current law is that there is a moratorium in place, the learning period, which lasts until 2023, and that specifically is intended to prevent the FAA from issuing regulations that are designed to ensure the safety of the flight crew or spaceflight participants. So we believe that would preclude us from issuing new regulations. Now, we certainly can work with industry on voluntary consensus standards, and that's what we're planning to do.
From an industry perspective, are voluntary consensus standards enough? Mr. MacCallum?
I believe all active industries will self-regulate, and putting together consensus standards helps create a unified baseline. However, we see so many different technologies that these standards must by necessity end up being performance standards, trying to regulate what the chances are. Because of that and this situation that we're in, that's why I think both regimes are beneficial, allowing industry to graduate into a more regulated environment where they can. I cannot speculate on the exact points of the law. I would hope that the FAA would be able to begin creating a parallel regulatory regime that is voluntarily, the industry can voluntarily move into, but that would be a point of law I would not be an expert on.
Dr. Dillingham, can you discuss a little bit more the issue that you brought up about liability exposure the FAA would have on, with regards to the issues that you brought up in your report? You talked through them a little bit in your testimony, a little more detail about it.
Yes, sir. There is a 3-tier insurance scheme for commercial space. At the first level is the maximum probable loss insurance that's required of the launch, and that is set on an individual basis by the characteristics of the launch with FAA. If that probable loss, if that loss exceeds that cap, which is $500 million now, then the federal indemnification comes into play, which is a little bit more than $3 billion. And if the loss or the damage exceeds that, the third level goes to the launch company itself. The problem with that, from our perspective, is that the calculation, the methodology that FAA uses to establish where that maximum probable loss is certainly dated by a few decades. And we've asked them to update that, because that determines when the feds become liable for the loss.
When the taxpayers become liable for the loss?
Yes, the taxpayers subject to appropriations from the Congress. So it's very important that that maximum probable loss insurance segment that's required of the launch company be accurate and not pull the taxpayer in before the taxpayer should be pulled in or is legislated to be pulled in.
Yeah. Okay. Has did the GAO find that there are enough folks then in the FAA to do inspections, to process licenses, to basically do the basic work that they would be required to do?
Mr. Larson, that's hard to say, but what the evidence has shown us, and we've talked to FAA about this, that in some cases they were unable to do some 10% of their required inspections for launches. We talked to FAA about that, and you know, what are the implications of this? What are the safety implications of this? The response that we got was that there were no safety implications, that the agency prioritized its inspections. I could not understand how a critical mission guaranteeing safety and not able to do those inspections was not, you know, something that needed to be dealt with. We told FAA and recommended to FAA, and they are following through on that, to, if they need more resources, that in order to make that case to Congress, they had to present better information so Congress could evaluate the need, and that had to be based on a more detailed explanation of what are the actual duties and responsibilities that the agency has, and how does it match up with the resources they have. And as we've seen, and everyone's testified to this morning, there's expanding responsibilities, increasing launches, but at the same time, the relative size of the FTEs is pretty much been level across the board and not matching. So a lot of this is on FAA in terms of making that presentation to Congress to justify the resources that they will need.
Thank you. I have just one more question. Mr. Gold, did you want to weigh in on that question? You seem,
I would love to,
yeah.
and I really appreciate
Sure.
the question, Congressman. I believe the funding situation is just critical. Congressman DeFazio hit safety. It's only a matter of time until safety suffers due to lack of funding. I'd like to compliment your colleagues, Congressman Bridenstine, Congressman Kilmer, who have fought to at least get the presidential budget request for FAA-AST this year and match what's in the Senate. But as you've heard from everyone on this panel, the field is expanding, and to just look at launches is a very poor way of judging what AST needs in terms of resources. As I said in my testimony, the ComStack at every meeting has endorsed the need for more funding. When have you seen companies asking for more funding for the regulators before? If we don't deal with this, I believe the repercussions would be dire, not just to safety, but maybe a little less important than safety, but still important, is the health of the industry. That AST will be caught in a triage situation where they'll probably have to look at activities that involve the government first and only then look at the private sector funded activities. This is the exact opposite message that we want to send to entrepreneurs, to innovators who are putting their own money into these projects. So not only for safety, but for the competitiveness of America, we must deal with this issue.
yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you may wonder why I'm here, but we have a lot of space activity in Alaska, more primarily in launches. But, you know, I was just sitting here thinking, you know, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue without any regulations. And I'm a little concerned in this new vision that you have, and thank you, all of you, for this, that what we've watched over the years is regulations stifle the imagination, the entrepreneurship, and this is a fledgling industry. It really is something that's down the road. I'll never see the final of it, I know that. But it's something I believe this nation is going to be faced with, and it'll be exciting. It'll be something that we can all look upon with great pride. What I don't want is the baby to be suffocated with too many blankets. And all due respect to you, Dr. Nield, is the FAA doesn't have the greatest reputation in the world right now. And we're working on a renewal of that bill, as you know. And I just wondered, Dr. Nield, do you think that you should be the agency, or should we have another group of people that would write regulations with the cooperation of the industry itself? I'm afraid you're going to get some college graduate or some non-college graduate involved writing regulation and not knowing the effect upon the industry, which has happened in a lot of the other agencies. Do you think you're the only one in the street now? Do you think you're the appropriate one, or should there be another agency to work with the industry to make sure it's safe?
We very much believe that we're the right people to do this, and although I respect the fact that different people have different opinions on this, I believe that the dual mandate of the ensure public safety and encourage, facilitate, and promote the industry, and based on the instructions in the law to regulate only to the extent necessary to meet international obligations, public safety, foreign policy, and national security interests of the U.S. That's the right calibration for us. We're strongly interested in seeing not only safe but also successful operations by the industry. So we believe we are doing a good job of that, and certainly encourage you to continue to interact with industry to see if they agree with that assessment. We believe we can do that dual mandate, ensuring public safety and continuing to support the great
Again,
innovation.
My concern is, Mr. Chairman, maybe there ought to be some type of direction so that that cooperation continues, because the agency itself changes personnel. and they change attitudes, not just you, I'm talking about every agency, about how the industry should interface with one another. The biggest complaint we're having after my years in Congress is the people directly affected are never consulted when the regulations are being written. Does anybody want to comment on that? Mr. Gold?
Thank you, Congressman. And again, I appreciate the point you're making. A good example of what you're referring to is export control regulations. Had export control and ITAR existed for Columbus, he would still be in Europe today.
Right.
The overbroad and often irrational way that export controls were implemented took America from being the only country that would conduct commercial space launches to often having only one launch per year. Companies would pay millions of dollars to meet burdensome government requirements that often had almost no relation to reality, protecting parts and components that you could purchase at a Radio Shack instead of actually protecting technologies that we needed to. So I'm very concerned with this topic, but I can assure you that there is no better relationship between industry and a regulator than what we have with the FAA. I think the group that you're almost referring to is actually the ComStack, that we are the backbone with industry that remains regardless of who's in charge at AFA, FAAST. I've served with ComStack under George's predecessor and George, and the way that Dr. Nield interacts with us, the way that the AST works cooperatively with industry has been tremendous and necessary. That, as Tabor points out, there's a great diversity in technologies, and this is not a well-understood field, frankly, by government. No one knows more about private sector systems than the private sector.
That's right.
And I assure you, Dr. Nield has reached out, as well as his people, to work hand in glove with us. If they had not, we would not be here asking for more funding for Dr. Nield, I assure you.
Again, I hope, Dr. Neal, you understand, if you get more funding, it's going to go directly to the program that has space exploration, not being spread around looking at my tail numbers on my airplane, if you follow what I'm saying. So that's just, my time is up, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to participate.
Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Don't worry, the tail numbers are available commercially on a real-time basis, so you don't have to worry about the government there looking at you, Don. I just want to return to the question. I understand that we want to promote this industry, and we do. You know, this is great for the U.S. to maintain our leadership in space. But the question is, why would we have the same agency promote and oversee safety? Why wouldn't it be the Commerce Department or some other part of the government that would do that? Again, I mean, no offense, Dr. Nield, but I heard exactly those same things a couple of months before ValueJet when my amendment was defeated, and then my colleague said, oops, that doesn't look too good, does it? And so there's, you know, why wouldn't it be appropriate to have another agency of the federal government, more appropriate, like Commerce, promote?
Thank you for that question. I think an important part of that is exactly what do we mean by the terminology. And so let me explain how we interpret that phrase, encourage, facilitate, and promote, by saying what it's not. It is not favoring one company over another. It is not cutting corners. It is not compromising when we come to public safety. In fact, we do have that perfect safety record with 290.
Yeah, but the qualification being no member of the public has been killed.
Which is the
and
job that
there are
Congress has
some
given to us.
criticisms in the NTSB regarding the process that went forward, you know, the construction of the vehicle before, you know, there was any review by FAA asked, and the whole human factors interaction issue that was, they do say, however, some FAA technical staff members reported their questions did not directly relate to public safety, were filtered by FAA management to reduce the burden on scaled. Well, unfortunately, someone died. So, you know, that leads me exactly to the point I'm making. That pressure was exerted, and they complied because of your promotional mandate. Dr. Dillingham, do you have anything to comment on this? Is there another agency of government that could do the promotion and they could just focus on, and maybe they wouldn't have to hire a bunch more people if they just focused on that part?
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. In one of our earlier reports, we made that exact point, that there is either inherent or potential conflict with the dual mandate of promotion and safety oversight. We also made the recommendation that FAA work with the Department of Commerce to come up with a memorandum of understanding that would in fact delineate which of the agencies would be responsible for what part of promotion in line with their statutory situation as well as their mission. So bottom line, we still think that that is something that needs to be looked at. It's hard to know where that line is drawn, but the more the industry expands with all the different kinds of vehicles and technologies, it is still a risk and will become even more of a risk.
Okay, thank you. Now, back to this, the insurance. I'm struggling with this a little bit. When did FAA set the $500 million cap on acquired insurance? Yep.
Sorry. In the mid-'80s, I think.
Okay. And they also have this, then where you have the federal government indemnification, which back then I think was estimated to be 1.5 billion. But now we're adjusting that part for inflation and saying the potential government indemnification, subject to appropriation, might be a problem there, is 3.06 billion, but we haven't talked about the 500 million and indexing that to inflation. So why are we indexing the government, the taxpayers' liability to inflation, but not the, the required acquisition of insurance?
I think Dr. Nield?
Yeah.
My understanding is both of those numbers are inflation adjusted. I could be not correct on that, but
I don't know. My understanding is the documents I have say from the GAO. Now, I'd be happy to be that it was set at 500 and that hasn't been indexed.
Congressman, if I could just comment, I think the reason that we really don't know the answer to that question is because that number practically has never been approached. It's actually set by the MPL with a cap of $500 million, and if the maximum probable loss is calculated to be less than that, then the question has never been asked, and as I understand it, that's been the case.
Okay. So, I mean, wouldn't this vary per operation depending upon you're launching out of a heavily populated area, you're launching in a very remote area, the trajectory that you're going to use, et cetera? Shouldn't it vary on each
yes, it
one?
should, and it does. So we calculated a separate maximum probable loss for each vehicle, each location, and as long as it is less than that cap of $500 million, then that is the number in terms of how much insurance needs to be purchased.
Okay, but if someone were doing something that you thought was going to exceed 500 million, you would just say, well, you buy 500 and the government will take care of the rest?
That's the general principle, although I think it's important to recognize that it's a conditional payment of excess third-party claims. So it is not a guarantee, and Congress would need to be persuaded that that was the appropriate thing to do to reimburse the third parties that have suffered under that condition.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Duncan.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Where are we in relation to other countries?
Till the 500.
Dr. Nield, are any other countries further along in this area than we are? Or?
There's a bit of a dichotomy. It was mentioned previously that we are currently relying on the Russians to take our astronauts to the International Space Station, although industry is working hard to bring that capability back to the U.S. But in terms of specifically commercial space transportation, including suborbital space flight, the U.S. is far and away in the lead right now, and that's because of the creativity and innovation of our American industry, and also, frankly, I believe because of the proactive way that we have set up a regulatory framework that lets everyone know what's expected, what the rules are going to be. You can factor that into your planning, and you can proceed under an informed consent regime as opposed to insisting upon zero risk. So that's a different environment that any other country has put into place.
Well, I would have assumed that we were ahead, particularly you talked about the Russians, their economy's in tatters, and so I wouldn't expect that there would be a lot of commercial space programs over there. But I'm like Mr. DeFazio, I was going to ask some questions about this indemnification procedure. According to the information we have, it's been in effect since 1988, 28 years now, and it's not been invoked yet. It's still in the law till 2025. I know there are some businesses and industries that the federal government insures, but not many. Most businesses that I could go into, or that one could go into, are not insured, are not backed up by the federal government. Why is it still necessary that we place this potential liability on the taxpayers? I mean, maybe it was done at the first to encourage a new industry, but when it's gone on this long.
So thank you for that question. My understanding is that this is something that is very important to industry in terms of being internationally competitive. Most other nations have a much more supportive environment in terms of an indemnification regime. But the other thing to remember is that in that period of time, the 28 years, it has never resulted in the cost of a single dime to the taxpayers because of the safety culture and the structure that we've set out. So it is working well, in our opinion.
Yes, Dr. Dillingham.
Mr. Duncan, when you spoke about Russia, and I think it's important to note that in terms of indemnification, where we have a cap of the 3.06 million, there is no cap in Russia, so that, you know, they have a two-tier system. Once the launch company, reaches its goal, then the government will support any amount of damage that occurs. And it's one of the concerns that the U.S. has in terms of competitiveness of launches, that if they have a better regime of indemnification and insurance, that companies may, move towards offshore rather than U.S. launch them. So that indemnification is really important.
All right. Thank you very much.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman Lobiando and Ranking Member Larson. This is for all the witnesses. Congress previously imposed a moratorium to prevent the FAA from issuing more robust regulations on the operational safety of commercial spaceflight until 2023. And the rationale was essentially to avoid over-regulating an emerging industry in its infancy. Do you think that this moratorium needs to be revisited, and should it end earlier or be extended? Based on what's actually happening in the industry today, what do you all think about updating the operational safety rules currently in place?
I think it's important to make the system that we're in right now permanent. I want to address a point that Ranking Member DeFazio brought up, which I think elucidates this. AST regulates the safety of uninvolved public property, national airspace. So these activities, these launches, are very heavily regulated. We've chosen not to regulate the safety of the passenger because it is frankly an experience. It's not common carriage. We're not taking a person from one place to another. As an experience, I believe it is not in the public's interest to have the safety of the participant regulated. Furthermore, it's not in the public's interest to regulate the safety of a test pilot developing new technologies. These are risks we want our industry to take. And so what happened with Virgin Galactic is tragic, but it is the kind of thing that happens as we develop new technologies. And it is not in any way the fault of AST or Dr. Nield's leadership that happened. Dr. Nield was regulating to the letter of the law, and I believe has no fault, and we should not be, Monday morning quarterbacking, both looking at the report from after the accident or the work that was done at AST. I believe they have done a great job, and we should maintain this regulatory regime because it is building a great industry, and giving it more stability is appropriate. When it goes to common carriage, selling a ticket from one point to another, New York to Sydney, then I believe we are, and appropriately in coherence with the regulations, in a place where we should regulate the safety of the passenger, but only then.
And if I could just chime in as well, Congressman, to echo Tabor's sentiments, no new frontier has ever been settled without loss of life. It's unfortunate, it's tragic, it's happened before, and I'm afraid it will happen again. Again, what Dr. Nield and AST did was not driven by their desire to promote the industry or that aspect. It was the legislative authority that they were given. This is a decision that Congress has made, the administration has made, and unless that changes, there's nothing more that Dr. Nield can or should do in that arena. And I believe that we have struck a good balance in this area. The ComStack has set up the standards working group, and I would welcome our vice chair to say more about we in industry are doing here. But what remains undone, and what I'd like to say in response to a previous question about are we behind foreign countries, you've heard many of us talk about this Article 6 concern of authorization and continuing supervision. Other countries have already dealt with that issue and dealt with it well. I just recently spoke to some colleagues and friends from United Arab Emirates who are busy setting up a regime that does recommend and support safety, but creates an environment that is conducive to innovation, to growth. And if the United States can't even deal with this simple fundamental issue of addressing an existing international obligation, well, then where are we as an industry? So rather than looking at the moratorium, which I think we can have a discussion about, this is a near-term question that has to be dealt with alacrity, and then I think we can continue to investigate moratorium and look at what the ComStack and Commercial Spaceflight Federation and industry as a whole are doing relative to developing industry standards.
As you know, the moratorium was recently extended, but as the U.S. is operating under that moratorium, one of the things that's supposed to happen during the course of that is the collection of operational data and experiences, which would in fact feed into the development of regulations when that time is appropriate and Congress makes that pronouncement. However, from what we can learn, there's been not a lot of coming together of presenting operational information from the various companies for competitive reasons or other kinds of reasons. So as the moratorium goes forward, it's going to be important that the most safety-related operational information is available to FAA so that it can, in fact, have a basis for regulation when that time comes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Hanna.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Nield, Dr. Nield, do you, you've heard the testimony, I know, and it's an interesting dynamic. A moratorium seems to be the antithesis of, and yet at the same time agree with Mr. MacCallum that if you need a moratorium, then you're not capable of doing the job. What would you wait for? And I'm thinking of the next generation aviation, which you're familiar with, just 20 years behind now. Mr. MacCallum, this industry is, there are many different groups in it. It's a great opportunity depending on who you are and what your risk level of risk you're able to take. But I mean, is it possible to do everything everybody wants to do here successfully without having a great deal of latitude in the process? Because there are multiple ways of doing this and ideas, and we've seen that over the last 5 or 10 years.
I believe the current system that protects the public, national airspace, private property, is actually working very well. The safety record speaks for itself. I believe we should not be regulating where we don't need to regulate. We certainly should regulate where common carriage exists. But
So we're not behind yet.
I'm sorry?
Internationally, we're not behind yet, but yet being the operative word.
Well, I believe one should never underestimate one's competition.
Right.
And it is quite easy for emerging countries to develop sets of laws that are more favorable than ours. The instability that we have in calling something a temporary moratorium or learning period makes other countries attractive.
It looks like a cheap excuse.
I believe stability and regulation is one of the foundations on which our economy is grown, and we should continue that prerogative.
What do you think, Dr. Nield? Can you manage all that?
So Congress has decided to extend this moratorium until 2023. In the ideal world, though, I think we should be working right now to set up what the permanent framework looks like. And so if that was done appropriately with, for example, a top-level regulatory structure where the details of exactly what you have to do is based on industry-developed consensus standards, then I think you have the best of both worlds, because you've got the government oversight, you've got a permanent regime that everyone can count on, but those details of what is required are developed by the people who know it, that have built and designed and are operating these systems. So to the extent that we can encourage progress along that approach, I think that would be the best of all worlds.
Congressman, I think it's important to remember just how young this industry is. We don't even know what we don't know in many instances yet. A great diversity of technologies and approaches. And as Dr. Nield says, and the ComStack has been proactive in working with AST, we need to use this time with the moratorium to figure out what should be done, what can be done, and it's ultimately a balance. You know, we have international competition here, safety over here, and we have to work together as industry and government to find that Goldilocks zone where we protect the uninvolved public and protect everyone else, yet don't deter industry. And I think we've had a very collegial and very productive relationship between AST and government so far.
Does everyone agree with that?
This is the foundation of my proposal, to have two parallel regulatory regimes, because it takes the heat out of the situation now where industry is looking down the road at the end of the moratorium and regulations changing, but we're spending huge amounts of money. Over almost $3 billion was invested just in 2015 in developing vehicles, but we don't know what those new regulations might be. So it's an inherent threat to the industry. By creating a parallel regime that adopts industry standards and does exactly what Dr. Nield has just recommended, and allowing a voluntary graduation from a license to an extended license, I think we create the environment that both encourages new technologies that may come along in 8 years to work in a regulated environment where there is informed consent, and allow the graduation to one where the safety of the participant is regulated.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here, especially Mr. Gold. I think you have some familiarity with Southern Nevada from your time at Bigelow. A lot of people come to my district, get transported to another dimension, but they don't usually think about it as space travel. So appreciate your knowledge. I'd like to address my question to you, Mr. Gold, and to Dr. Nield. You know, we're just a couple of weeks away from the reauthorization again of the FAA bill. The Senate has passed a version, and we have a version over here on the House side that calls for privatization of air traffic control system. Part of the problem with that is that it puts the decision-making in the hands of a commission or a committee that's dominated by just primarily one special interest, and leaves out a lot of the players, including commercial space industry. So I would ask you, Mr. Gold, if you would be satisfied with the system that where they determine rates and access and every bit of use of the airspace where you're not at the table. And I would ask Dr. Nield if he would comment on kind of the relationship between the Office of Commercial Space and air traffic, and I know it's a substantial one, and what kind of challenges would be posed if we move to this new system that's in the House bill.
So first, Congresswoman, let me congratulate you and your constituent, Bigelow Aerospace, and everyone in Southern Nevada who worked to get the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module onto the International Space Station. I used to say that Bigelow Aerospace was the biggest gamble in Las Vegas, but no longer.
That's right.
And it's going in a great direction, and congratulations to you. Again, we've talked a lot about regulatory risk, you know, choking the child in its crib, and I think what you raise is an excellent example of this. Again, we are dealing with a young industry, one that is just leaving the cradle and beginning to walk. And if we suffocate it with regulations and particularly regulations where we are not able to interact, to have that seat at the table, to provide the advice. Because again, this is not the aviation industry. These are not mature systems that government officials have great experience and knowledge of. Most of the experience with commercial spaceflight systems remain only in that company itself because they're so unique and so different and so immature at this time. And part of the reason that you see myself and others in industry be so supportive of Dr. Nield is not only due to his excellent leadership, but Dr. Nield and his predecessors have always had a seat for us at the table. It's part of why I'm here at this hearing with the ComStack. And any system that does not allow us that insight, that transparency, and that voice, I would strongly be against.
Thank you. Doctor?
Yes, I would just point out that the FAA has a strategic initiative that is intended to integrate commercial space activities with other users of the NAS. So that includes the UAS flights as well as the commercial space. We're trying to make sure that you can operate both kinds of systems without negatively impacting others. And today we've been working very closely with the Air Traffic Organization for what's happening today and with the Next Gen office, including the FAA Technical Center, for what we want to happen tomorrow. But based on that close collaboration and the research that we're doing right now, I feel pretty confident that we will be able to continue that relationship regardless of what Congress decides to do on the future of the ATO.
So you think it would work out if you privatize air traffic controllers and they don't have a seat at the table and you're kind of taken out of the picture?
I'm confident that we
don't
can
want to
make
say
it
that.
work whichever way Congress decides to proceed.
Okay. Thank you.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've heard a common theme of a new frontier, an emerging industry, young industry. Mr. López-Alegría, help me understand what the tipping point is when it does move to the common carriage that Mr. MacCallum mentioned. When do we stop having the conversation about an immature industry and start having the conversation about safety in a mature industry that's ready for commercial travel?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. I think what Mr. Gold referred to before in the ComStack's standards working group, we've started to lay out this roadmap to regulation, and we've identified some milestones which clearly don't have dates or anything associated with them. The first step is to develop consensus industry standards with the participation of FAA, AST, and any stakeholder, government, private, doesn't matter. At some point, and I'll get back to when that point is in just a second, we could use that standard, those standards, as a basis of some sort of primitive regulation per se. And at some point when we get to the time when we're a common carrier, as Mr. MacCallum has pointed out, it might be appropriate to certificate these airplanes like the FAA does with commercial carriers. That obviously is way out in the future, and we at this table would be extremely excited to be here when that happens, but it's really far away.
Will it be obvious to me as an outside observer what the difference is between a adventurer and an explorer and someone who's seeking common carriage? How do I tell that transition is happening?
Well, I think the concept of common carriage means you're going from sort of point A to point B routinely. I mean, how we define that, I think, is sort of in the eyes of the beholder, but I think there'll be a mechanism to make that judgment when the time is right. On the first tipping point, though, between when we do not issue regulations for occupant safety and when we do, right now there is a moratorium that will expire in 2023 unless it's extended again. It was originally supposed to expire in 2012. And it didn't expire because when it was written in 2004, we thought, well, in 8 years we'll be there. Well, 8 years came and went and we weren't there. And then 3 more years came and went, we still weren't there. And now we've decided it's going to take another 8 years. And maybe 8 years isn't long enough either. I think the point is it isn't a date, it's an accumulation of experience and gathering the data that Dr. Dillingham referred to so that we can make, we have the basis on which to make fundamental sound regulation helped with these standards. So the CSL-CA that was referred to by the chairman asked for a report to identify what are the metrics? What is it? If it's not a date, is it a number of takeoffs and landings? Is it so many hours of flight time? And they're off working that, and I think that report is due later this year. But that's the kind of answer that we hope to get.
Okay. Mr. MacCallum, I agree with you. I think a stable regulatory foundation is what our economy is built upon. But I've looked at your website. I've thought about packing a picnic basket and getting a few friends and coming over, because I think I understand balloon travel, and I would be regulated for safety today on anybody's balloon but yours. What was that process for the FAA that distinguished what you're doing as space travel as opposed to just the common balloon experience I would expect?
So we looked at being certified as a hot air balloon is certified. The difficulty is that those regulations are built around a vehicle that goes a few thousand feet in the air under a wicker basket with a cotton envelope. We're going 30 kilometers up into the edge of space in a balloon the size of a football stadium. So it's a whole new technical realm. And there really wasn't a process in the certification side, aviation safety side of the FAA, to really encompass what is fundamentally a spacecraft hanging under a very large balloon at the edge of space. However, the regulatory system that has been set up for commercial space, where the public is protected, property, national interests are protected, but we're allowed to develop a new technology under that regulatory regime, is frankly what allowed the investment and our progress to go forward. Without that kind of regulatory regime, we would be unable to move forward, because we would have to develop the FAA's understanding of our technology in a certification process that would frankly take too long and have too many inherent risks. I think we know when we've gone from an adventure to travel under common carriage by the very definition of common carriage in the regulations, which is that you're holding out to take a person from a point to a point. An easier way to think of this is, if I'm buying a ticket because my boss told me I had to get to Sydney in an hour, then that's common carriage, because I'm not taking that flight because of the adventure and the experience. I'm taking that flight because my boss told me to. And in that case, it is reasonable to regulate the safety of the occupants. If I'm just going to space, or I'm a researcher, or I'm going for the experience, I'm doing it because that's either my profession or more desired experience. And I think we can make that distinction pretty clear, and there will be a market forever for people who want to go experience space. And the existing regulatory regime is perfect for that experience, much like any other sport that we see, where the person's themselves' safety is not regulated, but the impact to the broader community is.
I thank you all for your expertise. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Nield, can you describe the current process for alerting air traffic control to a spacecraft that will re-enter the atmosphere and pass through the NAS?
Yes, our current launch and reentry activities require us to work very, very closely with the air traffic organization, and so we engage them from the very start. When someone comes in and wants a launch license, part of that license is the requirement for a memorandum of agreement between the operator and the ATO concerning what days, what times, what conditions those can take place. As we get closer to the launch, we're picking the dates, the times. We're putting out notices to airmen and notices to mariners 48 hours ahead of time, and as appropriate, would either implement the flight under restricted areas or have temporary flight restrictions to ensure that the launch or reentry does not negatively impact any of the existing air traffic. So it's a continuing process, and it's working very well. In the future, we want to try to automate that so that it's not such a manual process with telephone calls and typing in data on the keyboard, but rather can take real-time data and have that directly show up on the air traffic controllers' screens.
Thank you. Dr. Dillingham, according to the August 2015 report, your testimony is based on AST's 2015 business plan contained a plan to determine the feasibility of a voluntary safety reporting system, which has been very successful in enhancing commercial aviation safety. In your view, has the FAA made any progress in establishing such a system for commercial space transportation sector?
Mr. Chairman, from what we were able to learn, FAA made an effort to establish that voluntary reporting system. However, they did not receive the kind of cooperation that they needed from the launch companies themselves, meaning that they were not really forthcoming with operational data for concerns with competitiveness and proprietary information. As of the last time we spoke to FAA, that had not changed. It may require some kind of legislative relief in order to protect that kind of information if the companies decide to share it.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment on that? No. Mr. López-Alegría, in your testimony, you stated the fact that the occupant safety is not yet regulated in commercial space flight does not mean that it's not safe. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think regulation doesn't make things safe, and not regulating doesn't make them not safe was a sort of simple point of what I was trying to get at. I think we've sort of talked at length here about why we think the appropriate regime, the current regime is appropriate. In fact, premature regulation could reduce safety by eliminating viable technical solutions to problems that would from what would be more effective than what might be imposed by government regulation. So a lot of people point to the unfortunate accident by Scaled Composites and say, well, there's proof that we're not safe. Again, I think that AST did the job which they were directed to do by Congress. These sorts of accidents are part and parcel of any development program. I don't need to point back to Apollo 1 or the 2 space shuttle accidents. This is a tough business, and it's dangerous. My point is that regulating it right now would not make it safer.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Larson?
Yeah, just a closing statement, Mr. Chairman. It's been 7 years since this particular committee or subcommittee has had a hearing on commercial space. Other committees have, but we haven't really explored our jurisdiction on this in 7 years, and I don't want it to be 7 years before we do this again. There's a lot to absorb, I think, as the industry grows, and we need to, I think, put as much attention into this as we're putting into things like UAS in order to stay on top of these issues. So I hope that we can have a follow-up or explore some new issues or other issues in this. Certainly, maybe perhaps knocking on wood early on in the next Congress.
Are you also volunteering for an experience?
I have enough experiences in this job every day, and I think this is about as close as I'm going to get to commercial space in my lifetime, right here.
I want to thank the panel very much. It was very enlightening. We appreciate your expertise. We appreciate your service, and we hope to be in touch. Hearing is adjourned.